Annotating paragraphs 24 through 25. Let's go ahead and start with 24. And in 24, when we can go ahead and circle this entire one, because to me, this is kind of, there's not a climax because this is an essay, but this is his thesis, so it is the most important. And so when we look at this right here, we need to know where we stand. We need to speak softly and respect others and share what we have. We need to pray not for material gain, but for the rains, for the fields, for the sun to nurture growth, for nights in which we can sleep in peace, and for a harvest in which everyone can share. Simple lessons from a simple man. And I've already written this, but let me go ahead and show you what we have here. So this paragraph is where he comes full circle. Up and until this point in the story, he has given us multiple examples of what he has learned from his abuelo. He began with how the elders, and that's the abuelitos and abuelos, had a connection to the earth and understood how man, land, and animal were a part of his this universal web of life. This message here is how he took what was learned and made it applicable to his adult life. And so this is what I was talking about when I said he kind of Mr. Miyagi-'d you, because what he ended up doing essentially was he took all of these stories that you just thought were stories about his grandfather, but then he applied it to his adult life. So he told you those stories that were taking place during his youth, but then he takes everything and he applies it to how it worked throughout his life now as an adult. And so we have paragraph 24 that discusses all of those things. So which was as deep and strong as the currents of the river of life. So this is another important idea that we want to go ahead and focus on. Now, when you look at paragraph 25, this right here is kind of what ends up happening with him as an adult. So let me go ahead. So he was a man, he died, not in his valley, but nevertheless cared for by his sons and daughters and flocks of grandchildren. At the end, I would enter his room, which carried the smell of medication and Vicks. Gone were the aromas of the fields, the strength of his young manhood. Gone also was his patience in the face of crippling old age. Small things bothered him. He shouted or turned sour when his expectations were not met. It was because he could not care for himself, because he was returning to that state of childhood, and all those wishes and desires were now wrapped in a crumbling old body. And so it's important to note that when his patience, crippling old age, small things bothered him, he shouted or turned sour when his expectations were not met, it was because he could not care for himself, because he was returning to that state of childhood, and those wishes and desires were now wrapped in a crumbling old body. So this, by no fault of his own, that strong man he had once been. This is frustrating and shows how we return to habits of our youth in a way. I don't want to say habits of our youth, but we return to the inability to take care of ourselves. Who's no longer at the top. think about it. He was not the one giving the advice. And the important thing is when you look at paragraph 26 is now, as a young man, he gives this advice to his grandfather. So remember the final transformation, and that was on page 25. He took the advice, was able to give it back to him. And this is an example of how the strength is going to be passed down from generation to generation. And it's really sad. You look at paragraph 27. This again, he talks about the strength of his youth. Not his youth, but Abuelo's. And he refers to him now as a legend. So he was this larger than life figure, and now in his death, he's became a small legend, the kind that make up every man's life. These are his stories, but this is essentially how he sees his grandfather. I mean, this is what he's remembered as. He doesn't want him to be remembered as the angry older man with a crippling body. It's important to note. And then you have paragraph 28, which is our next paragraph. They talk about the rich life that he had. I remember the last years that he spent in bed, and how, as I remember now, I'm reminded that it is too easy to romanticize old age. Sometimes we forget the pain of the transformation into old age. We forget the natural breaking down of the body. Not all go gently into the last years. Some go crying and cursing, forgetting the names of those they love most, withdrawing into an eternal anguish few of us can know. May we be granted the patience to care to deal with our ancianos. So this is that, again, his message, which is the respect of our elders. Okay. And then he talks about the American image created by the mass media as an image of youth and not of old age. And again, he discusses the disregard our society has for the elderly. And this image does not illustrate the real life of old ones. And then again, he talks about this cycle. This is the image of the circle of life that he goes for throughout this entire essay. And if you think about it, that message that his grandfather gave him in paragraph 17 or 16, 15, 16, no, maybe it was 16, where his friend died. I mean, that's what he said, in the fall, the leaves will fall, but in the spring, they bloom again. And it was that natural cycle of growth and change. So my grandfather pointed to the leaves falling from the trees. So this is the reference to the former paragraph of, I believe it was 16, about his friend's death. And so time brings with its transformation the often painful wearing down process, vision blurs. So this is that the autumn of life. And remember, leaves fall in the autumn, bloom again in the spring. And this is how he's referencing old age now. The same advice that his grandfather gave him. So my grandfather wanted to return to his valley to die, but by then the families of the valley had left in search of a better future. It is only now that there seems to be a return to the valley, a revival. The new generation seeks its roots. The value of love for the land moves us to return to the place where our ancianos formed the culture. I returned to Puerto de Luna last summer to join the community in a celebration of the founding of the church. I drove by my grandfather's home, my uncle's ranches, the neglected adobe washing down into the earth from whence it came. And this is that illusion. So this is the adobe representing his family. And go away. Yeah. What? There. From dust to dust. You remember? You've ever heard that at a funeral? So washing down into the earth from whence it came. So you see his ancestral home now becoming one with the earth, and I wondered how might the values of my grandfather's generations live in our own? What can we retain to see us through these hard times? I was to become a farmer, and I became a writer as I plow and plant my words. So I was to become a farmer, and I became a writer. So, how things change. Because even though he spent all that time with his grandfather, learning to become a farmer, his path changed. As I plow and plant my words, do I nurture as my grandfather did in his fields and orchards? The answers are not simple. So, like right here, this is interesting because as I plow and plant my words, so this is his reference to him as a writer.